Hello everyone. Today we will discuss and demonstrate vectors and arrays in C++ with a series of tutorial videos. There will be two different program concepts. We will show how the programs run when using either a vector or an array. Before we begin our discussion, we would like to cite our sources. All information and material used in this presentation was derived from Chapter 6 of the textbook Big C++, 2nd edition by K. Horstman and Timothy Budd. A vector is a collection of data items of the same type. Every element of the collection can be accessed separately. Like vectors, arrays collect elements of the same type. Once the size of an array has been set, it cannot be changed. If you are writing a program which needs to collect multiple elements of the same data type, a vector or an array should always be used rather than creating many independent variables. Vectors and arrays will allow you to easily store and access all your elements. Although vectors and arrays are very similar, there are some slight differences between the two. Here are some to name a few. Array parameters are always passed by reference. The return type of a function cannot be an array. On the contrary, these rules do not apply to vectors. The setup for creating vectors and arrays is an obvious difference. But their most prevalent difference would be that you cannot resize an array after its initial size has been determined, but you can do this with vectors. Also, the size of the array must be known when it is first created. However, this is not the case with vectors. For this reason, it is often simpler and far more convenient to use vectors as opposed to arrays. So, why do people still use arrays? The reason is that vectors were a recent addition to C++, and many older programs use arrays instead. Therefore, arrays are still an important topic in C++. Arrays are also faster and more efficient than vectors. This can be important in some applications. At any rate, having a deep knowledge of both vectors and arrays is essential for an experienced C++ programmer. We will begin the tutorials with a basic program which will ask the user to input an integer value for height and width. These inputted values will then be tested in a series of loops. It will use an array to store multiple characters which will then be used in our loops. When finished, the program should output the array's elements which will then display a square with mathematical symbols. Let's begin by writing our obligatory lines of code. #include input-output stream. This array will be holding multiple characters, and thus we will need to include a string header file and then lastly, using namespace standard and the integer main function. Let's proceed to create our array. The type of elements this array will hold will be characters, and thus we will make it a string type. We will name our array square. As previously mentioned, the size of an array must be declared at the time it is created. So then, we will now determine the size of our array. We want 3 different character outputs, thus the size of our array will be 3. Note that the slots in arrays are numbered starting at 0, therefore the last number we can access will actually be 2 and not 3. The 3 characters we have chosen to display our square are the greater than, plus, and less than symbols. Next, let's create variables for the height and width values of the square. They will be integers and we will call them square height and square width. Now, let's write code that will ask and allow the user to input their desired height and width values. Our array is finished and now we can use its elements to display a square. But first we must create a nested for loop. This loop will add elements into our array until it has been filled to the numbers that were previously inputted by the user. We want our loop to start at 1, so we will create an integer called width and initialize it to 1. Next we will see if the width is less than or equal to the square height, and if so, we will add 1 unit to our square. Then we add an if statement to test whether the width is less than or equal to 1. We must add another for loop. This time, however, we must see if the width is less than or equal to the square width. If so, our variable width is incremented by 1 unit. The first element in our array, square, 0, which is a greater than symbol, is then outputted by each increment. Next, we add an else if statement to our nested loop that tests whether the variable width is less than the square height. This deals with the element in slot 1 in the first row of the square. Again, we add another for loop as well as an if-else statement that takes care of the units in both columns of the square. This time, we create a variable named width2 and our if statement tests whether width2 is equal to 1 or if width2 is equal to square width. If so, it will display in square 1, which is the plus symbol in the second slot in our array. We also add some blank text so that there can be space between the two columns. Finally, we add our last for loop that completes our square by filling in the units of the bottom row. We repeat the same process as before, naming our variable width3 this time. The output will be square 2, which is the less than symbol in the third slot of our array. All elements in our array have now been utilized in order to display our square. We have now finished our first program. Let's compile and run it to see what our square looks like, first when the height is 15 and the width is 30. Then a second time when the height is 50 and the width is 100.